The morning frost still clung heavy to the tall prairie grass along the gravel county road, when Teresa realized her legs could no longer carry the weight of her body. For 3 grueling days, she had been walking the dusty backroads of rural Iowa, moving from one isolated farmstead to another, knocking on wooden doors, and receiving the exact same answer delivered in slightly different shades of rejection. Sometimes it was a soft, pitying shake of the head, other times a cold, sharp closing of the door, always preceded by a long, uncomfortable glance down at her prominent belly. She was 7 months pregnant, her unborn child riding high and heavy in front of her, announcing her desperate situation long before her lips could form a single word of plea. She tightened her trembling grip on the frayed strap of her canvas tote bag, feeling the deep, throbbing ache in her swollen feet inside her worn-out leather shoes. Pausing by the side of the road, she drew in a deep, agonizing breath of the crisp autumn morning air, which smelled richly of damp earth and distant wood smoke drifting from some hidden chimney. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming, but it was the hollow silence inside her chest that cut the deepest. A silence that had settled in on the dreadful night her boyfriend, Mark, packed his few belongings and walked out without leaving a note, a word of explanation, or a single dollar to her name. He had left behind only a cold mattress and a growing life inside her that now depended entirely on her fragile strength. Teresa no longer wept for Mark. She had cried every tear her eyes could produce during those first terrifying 48 hours. What remained was a single haunting question that returned to torment her every time the baby stirred in the dark hours before dawn, waking her up alone on the cold ground. How does someone who can barely take care of herself manage to protect and nourish a brand new human life? She had no logical answer to give herself, but she knew with absolute certainty that she had to keep moving forward. Stopping was a luxury that the desperate hunger of her unborn child simply would not allow. That was when she reached the crest of a gentle hill and caught sight of a grand white 2-story farmhouse with sky-blue shutters standing at the end of the road. In front of the wraparound porch lay a meticulously arranged garden, brimming with vibrant late-season roses, bright daisies, and heavy clusters of purple hydrangeas. There was something about the serene beauty of the homestead that made her chest tighten, not with fear, but with a sharp, almost painful surge of hope. The kind of fragile hope a person tries desperately to crush out of fear of being broken once again. She approached the weathered iron gate, rested her cold forehead against the chilled metal bars for a fleeting second, and summoned every ounce of courage she had left. This was the very last farm on this stretch of the county line, and beyond it, there was literally nowhere left for her to go. Sitting quietly on the far corner of the wide wooden porch, positioned to catch the pale warmth of the rising morning sun, sat a man in a wheelchair. Thomas took his morning air every single day at this exact hour, not out of any genuine pleasure, but purely out of rigid habit, the kind of mechanical routine a solitary soul builds to convince himself that his days still possess some semblance of order. He held a ceramic mug of black coffee that was slowly turning cold in his hand, his steel-gray eyes lost in the vast Midwestern horizon where the golden cornfields met the pale morning sky. At 50 years old, half of his life had been spent serving honorably in the military, with polished boots and a stern voice of authority, while the remaining 20 years had been spent confined to that wheelchair and that massive, hollow house after a devastating accident ended his career and stole his mobility. Thomas expected absolutely nothing more from life, and if anyone had bothered to ask him, he would have insisted that he was entirely content with that arrangement. It was a comfortable lie he had rehearsed so many times that he had almost come to believe it himself. He heard the faint, metallic clatter of the iron gate long before he saw who was standing there, his head turning slowly as his military instincts immediately registered the unexpected break in his daily routine. Through the sharp morning light, he saw her, a slender, tired young woman in a faded floral dress, her dark hair gathered in a loose, messy bun, holding her heavy stomach with one hand while leaning heavily on the gatepost with the other. Even from a distance, despite the deep lines of exhaustion etched onto her young face, Thomas recognized a quiet, unyielding dignity in her posture, a quiet refusal to hang her head low despite being thoroughly beaten down by circumstances, a look he saw in his own mirror every morning. "Good morning, sir," Teresa called out, her voice coming through the crisp air far steadier and clearer than she had anticipated. "I'm so sorry to disturb you this early in the morning, but I'm looking for work. I know how to cook, and I can clean, farm, or do whatever you need. I'm willing to accept any chore, any daily pay, or just a dry corner to sleep in." Thomas stared at her in complete, unmoving silence, for a duration that felt agonizingly long to them both, as the wind whistled gently through the dry grass. On the other side of the gate, Teresa felt her heart sink into her stomach, already preparing herself for the familiar rejection she had memorized over the past 3 days, mentally rehearsing how to swallow the bitter disappointment without letting her knees buckle. But the man in the wheelchair did not tell her to leave, nor did he immediately offer her shelter. He simply continued to study her countenance, as if reading something deeply personal, written across her features, that she herself did not even know was visible. "How long have you been walking along these back roads?" Thomas finally asked, his voice deep and gravelly, accustomed to giving commands, but carrying a faint, hidden roughness underneath that betrayed a long-buried emotion. "Since yesterday morning, sir," Teresa replied after a brief hesitation, deciding that honesty was her only remaining currency. "I had to sleep under a large oak tree down by the creek last night, but I promise you I am a hard worker. I won't cause you any trouble at all. I just desperately need a chance to earn my keep." Thomas averted his eyes for a split second, and in that brief moment, an intense, silent war raged within his chest. A hardened, protective part of him, the part built by 2 decades of absolute isolation, told him to inform the young woman that this was not a charity house, that he required no assistance, and that it was best for her to keep moving down the road. But another part of him, a fragile, ancient part he thought had died decades ago, remembered the distant memory of a kitchen filled with the warm aroma of home-cooked meals, of a gentle woman humming softly while stirring a simmering pot, and of a time when this cavernous house was actually a home. It was that buried memory that prevailed when, contradicting his own strictly guarded rules, he pushed the wheels of his chair forward, rolling down the wooden ramp toward the front gate. "The gate isn't locked," Thomas said plainly, his eyes focused on the horizon rather than directly on her face. "The kitchen is around back through the side porch. You'll find eggs, flour, and some leftover coffee grounds in the pantry. If you can cook as well as you claim, then prove it to me. But I'll warn you now, nobody in 20 years has managed to brew coffee in this house the way I like it." Teresa pushed the heavy iron gate open and stepped onto the gravel driveway, feeling for the very first time in weeks that perhaps, just perhaps, she had finally found a place to rest her feet. She did not yet realize that this rusted gate was not merely the end of a long, painful road of suffering, but the unexpected threshold of an entirely new chapter of her life. As she walked past him toward the back of the house, her pregnant silhouette cast long against the morning sun, Thomas muttered something softly under his breath, intended more for the quiet breeze than for her ears. "You say you need work," Thomas whispered, his gray eyes following her slow, exhausted steps as she rounded the corner of the porch. Then, without fully understanding why, something in that fleeting moment forced him to utter a profound truth he had not admitted to a single living soul in 2 decades of silence. "And I suppose I need a family." The heavy words escaped his lips like a secret kept hidden for far too long, floating briefly in the morning air before dissipating into the quiet farmyard. He looked around at the vast, empty property, at the silent horizon, and shook his head with a self-deprecating chuckle, privately acknowledging how absurd the thought sounded after so many years of bitter resignation. Teresa did not hear his faint confession, having already stepped inside the back door, which was fortunate, because that quiet admission was not meant for her to process just yet. It was a tiny seed that life would require many months to carefully nourish into bloom. The farmhouse kitchen was immense, boasting high ceilings with exposed wooden beams and a massive cast-iron wood-burning stove that looked as though it had been installed when the state was first settled. Polished copper pots hung from heavy iron racks along the wall, covered in a thin, uniform layer of gray dust that clearly signaled years of neglected disuse. Teresa gently brushed her fingertips against the rim of a copper skillet, feeling a poignant ache in her heart, as she realized this was a kitchen that had once been deeply cherished, a place that had nourished generations and served as the vibrant heart of a home, but had now devolved into a cold room where a lonely man simply warmed up pre-packaged meals. She set her canvas bag down in an unobtrusive corner, thoroughly washed her hands at the deep porcelain sink, and immediately went to work without asking a single question, understanding intuitively that her performance in this kitchen represented her solitary lifeline. As she carefully stoked the embers in the old iron stove and brought the fire to life, her thoughts drifted back to her late mother. It was her mother who had taught her every culinary secret she possessed, constantly reminding her that truly exceptional food does not rely on expensive ingredients, but rather on the degree of patience and genuine care poured into its preparation. A person can always taste it in the very first bite, Teresa, her mother used to tell her while standing over a steaming pot on rainy afternoons. They can instantly tell whether a meal was prepared with love or prepared in a hurry. Her mother had passed away several years ago, taken swiftly by an unforgiving illness, and ever since that devastating loss, Teresa cooked as a form of prayer, a quiet, daily dialogue with the loved one she had lost. Every egg she cracked and every pinch of salt she measured was her gentle way of keeping the memory of a remarkable woman alive, and now, in this strange, quiet house, she was cooking for her unborn child as well, desperate to prove that their shared existence was worth fighting for. Out on the front porch, Thomas pretended to read a 3-day-old local newspaper, though his eyes remained fixed on the exact same printed line for nearly 20 minutes. What he was truly doing was listening and smelling, noticing the incredible, long-forgotten aromas beginning to waft out from the kitchen windows and drift gently across the porch. It was the rich, inviting scent of freshly brewed dark roast coffee, thick-cut bacon crisping, and sweet batter cooking in real butter. It had been so many years since this old house had smelled of authentic, carefully prepared food that Thomas closed his eyes and inhaled deeply, allowing the sensory memory to accomplish what it always does best, cause a sharp pang of nostalgia, while simultaneously offering a strange, soothing comfort. For a brief, fleeting moment, he was no longer a retired, disabled officer living in self-imposed exile. He was once again a young boy sitting at his mother's wooden table, eagerly awaiting breakfast on a sunlit Saturday morning. When Teresa finally appeared at the porch door balancing a heavy wooden tray, Thomas quickly straightened his posture, adjusting his expression back into a hard, unyielding mask of stoic detachment. She carefully set down a plate featuring soft, perfectly scrambled eggs, golden toasted bread brushed with sweet butter, and a steaming mug of coffee that released an aroma he had not experienced in decades. Stepping back respectfully, she folded her hands over her belly and waited in complete silence, her heart pounding violently against her ribs, as she understood that her entire immediate future hinged on his reaction. Thomas reached for the mug first, bringing it slowly to his lips with the deep suspicion of a man who had been disappointed by life too many times to easily trust a good thing. He took a single, slow sip, and then froze completely, holding the cup motionless near his mouth as his gaze drifted toward a distant point in the past. The coffee was perfection, neither too bitter nor too weak, carrying that subtle, elusive smoothness that only someone who truly understood the craft could ever achieve. It was, down to the exact temperature and rich flavor profile, the precise coffee his mother had made for him in that very kitchen 50 years ago. Thomas felt his throat tighten with a sudden, overwhelming pressure, an emotional swell so intense that he had to swallow hard several times to prevent tears from welling up in his eyes. "Where on earth did you learn to make coffee like this?" he asked, his voice rough and slightly trembling at the edges, despite his best efforts to maintain control. "From my mother, sir," Teresa replied softly and simply. "She always taught me that good coffee requires absolute patience, and that you can never rush the water through the grounds." Thomas offered no immediate response, allowing the quiet breeze of the porch to say what his voice could not articulate. He looked down at the young pregnant woman standing humbly before him, a woman who had slept beneath a tree on the cold ground just hours prior, and then at the meal prepared with a level of exquisite care that no stranger had any right to expect. In that quiet moment, he realized that he had not merely hired a cook, he had opened his door to something far more profound, something inside him that had been dark for so long that he had convinced himself it could never be reignited. "There's a small bedroom down the hall near the back entrance," Thomas said eventually, keeping his eyes firmly fixed on his coffee cup. "It used to belong to my mother's housekeeper decades ago. It's covered in dust, but the bed frame is sturdy, and the roof doesn't leak. You can stay there, for now." Teresa had to lightly brace her hand against the wooden doorframe to keep her knees from giving out under the sudden wave of relief that washed over her. She nodded, managed to whisper a faint, choked, "Thank you, sir," and quickly retreated back into the kitchen before he could see the heavy tears spilling over her eyelashes. They were not tears of sorrow, but rather the pent-up tears she had held back for days, waiting for a safe space to finally let them fall. For the first time since Mark had abandoned her, Teresa had a solid roof over her head, and without fully realizing it, she had just begun to breathe new life into a man who had long since given up on living. The initial weeks on the Iowa farm were defined by a series of careful, deliberate silences. Teresa and Thomas moved through the expansive layout of the farmhouse like two celestial bodies in separate, distant orbits, acutely aware of each other's presence, yet maintaining a respectful, cautious boundary. She would wake long before the first light of dawn, scrub the kitchen counters, prepare a hearty breakfast, and arrange it neatly on the porch table where he preferred to eat while watching the sun rise over the fields. He would acknowledge her efforts with a brief, gruff nod or a low murmur of thanks, spending the remainder of his day in quiet contemplation. But Teresa, who had learned from her mother how to read people by what they left unsaid, quickly picked up on the subtle clues. His plate was always scraped completely clean, his coffee mug was always empty, and his eyes would occasionally follow her movements with a quiet curiosity when he assumed she wasn't looking. The house itself told the story of its owner far better than his words ever could. Along the walls of the long central hallway hung old, dark wood picture frames containing glimpses of a forgotten past. A serious young boy standing beside a woman with a remarkably gentle, radiant smile. A young man in a crisp military uniform, his chest filled with pride. A decorated officer shaking hands with high-ranking dignitaries. Yet, in not a single photograph was there a wife, nor were there any children playing on the green lawns. The life of Thomas, displayed along those quiet walls, was a narrative of high achievement intertwined with profound solitude, a collection of shiny medals masking a deep, pervasive absence. Teresa found herself lingering slightly longer whenever she dusted the frame containing the woman with the gentle smile, intuitively sensing that this was his mother, the woman whose coffee recipe she had unknowingly recreated. There was one specific photograph that captured her attention above all others: the young, serious boy standing near his mother's knee. The boy couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old, wearing short trousers and a neat side part, his expression entirely devoid of a smile, while his mother placed a warm, protective hand on his shoulder, her expression radiating enough love for the both of them. Teresa would gaze at the photograph while gently wiping the glass with a soft cloth, feeling a familiar ache in her chest, because she recognized that kind of family dynamic immediately. It was the portrait of a small family that possessed very little in terms of worldly wealth, but shared an incredible depth of devotion. Looking at the boy's serious eyes, Teresa realized that somewhere along the winding path of his long life, that little boy had been left entirely alone, and his mother's radiant smile had vanished from the home along with her passing. The truth was that the farmhouse was simply too vast for one solitary man. Entire rooms had remained tightly closed for decades, spaces where the air was thick with the scent of old wood, mothballs, and suspended time. Teresa began exploring these forgotten spaces slowly, cleaning them at a comfortable pace that suited her pregnant body. In every room, she discovered the same haunting pattern of a life that had once been rich and full before slowly draining away. Furniture draped in faded white sheets, fine porcelain china, locked behind glass cabinets, with no guests to serve, and a massive mahogany dining table built for 8 people, where a single man ate his solitary meals at the far end. During one of her afternoon cleaning sessions in the formal sitting room, Teresa pulled back a heavy dust sheet to reveal an upright mahogany piano tucked into the corner. She lifted the wooden key lid with immense care, running her fingertips over the aged ivory keys, some of which had yellowed with the passage of time. She did not know how to play a single note, yet there was something profoundly beautiful and terribly sad about the silent instrument, resting in the shadows, as if waiting for a musician who was never coming back. She had no way of knowing that it was Thomas's mother who used to play that very piano on quiet Sunday afternoons, while her young son played on the rug, or that on the day she passed away, the music in the house had died along with her. Teresa carefully replaced the white sheet over the piano with the delicate, tender touch of someone tucking a sleeping child into bed. But the memory of the silent instrument lingered in her mind throughout the rest of the day. At night, resting in the quiet sanctuary of her small bedroom, Teresa would speak softly to her unborn baby. She would place her warm hand over her rounded belly, whispering promises into the dark, assuring the little life inside her that they were going to make it through the hardship. "We found a safe place to rest, my sweet little one," she would whisper, as the night wind rustled through the oak trees outside her window. "It isn't much, and it might not be ours forever, but it's a real start." The baby would often respond with a soft, distinct kick against her palm, which felt to Teresa like the purest form of love available in the world. She spent her days caring for Thomas with the same instinctual devotion she was preparing to give her child, learning through sheer determination how to tend to another soul's needs. Naturally, there were dark nights when terror would creep into her thoughts, as it inevitably does for any woman facing motherhood entirely alone. Lying on the narrow mattress, listening to the crickets in the yard and the creaking of the old timbers, she would find herself spiraling into fearful questions about what would become of her in a month or two when the baby arrived. What if the stern retired officer changed his mind? What if she failed as a mother? What if this peaceful sanctuary was merely another temporary comfort that life was planning to strip away from her? But whenever those thoughts threatened to overwhelm her, the baby would move, and she would take a slow, deep breath, recalling her mother's favorite saying, "We will cross that bridge when we reach it, my darling, and not a single moment before." Strengthening her resolve, She would close her eyes, falling into the exhausted sleep of someone who had labored honestly all day, ready to rise before the sun, to brew the morning coffee just right. Meanwhile, Thomas was undergoing a quiet transformation of his own, though he would have adamantly denied it if confronted. Where he used to lie in bed until late morning, out of a total lack of purpose, he now found himself wide awake before dawn, eagerly listening for the subtle sounds of the kitchen coming to life, and waiting for the rich aroma of breakfast to float down the hallway. He used to eat purely out of physical necessity, chewing mechanically without tasting his food. Now, he caught himself anticipating each meal with genuine curiosity, wondering what clever dish the young woman would create out of the simple staples in his pantry. She possessed a remarkable talent for turning the ordinary into something extraordinary. A simple pot of vegetable soup tasted like a celebration. A Sunday roasted chicken filled the entire residence with warmth, and a pan of skillet cornbread was so delicious he found himself eating half of it before he even realized it. With every dish she served, another small piece of the cold, dead house seemed to awaken. The first significant tear in the wall between them occurred on a humid Wednesday afternoon. Thomas had fallen asleep in his wheelchair on the side porch, overcome by the summer heat. When he awoke, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, and he felt a sharp wave of hunger accompanied by his usual defensive irritability, fully assuming he would have to forage for a cold meal by himself, as he had done for 20 years. But upon wheeling his way into the kitchen, he found a hot plate carefully covered with a porcelain bowl to retain its heat, alongside a handwritten note, penned in neat, careful cursive. "Your dinner is kept warm right here, Mr. Thomas," the note read. "I left everything fresh for you. If you need anything else at all, I am in my room. Enjoy your meal." Positioned neatly beside the note was a single bright yellow daisy from the front garden, placed inside a small glass of fresh water. Thomas stood frozen in the center of the twilight-lit kitchen, his eyes fixed on that simple yellow flower for a long, unmoving moment. A single daisy in a glass, a warm plate left waiting by someone who genuinely cared whether he ate a hot meal tonight or went to bed hungry. It had been 20 long years since his mother's passing, and in all that time, not a single person had ever left a warm plate waiting for him, nor had anyone cared if he was lonely or nourished. He had existed in a world where his daily presence made no tangible difference to anyone, becoming so accustomed to that profound isolation that it felt as familiar as a dull, chronic ache. But that simple gesture shattered something hard and calcified deep within his chest. He slowly raised a hand to his face, utterly startled to feel the wetness of a tear slipping down his cheek. That evening, Thomas ate his dinner at the wooden kitchen table in complete silence, savoring every single bite with an intensity he had not experienced in decades. When he finished, instead of leaving the dirty dish in the sink as was his habit, he washed the plate by hand, dried it carefully with a cloth, and put it away in the cupboard. He stood alone in the quiet kitchen, surrounded by the subtle warmth of a restored home, and whispered a quiet word to the empty air, a word that no one else heard, and one he wasn't even entirely sure he had spoken aloud. "Thank you." He wasn't entirely sure who he was thanking, whether it was the young woman, his late mother, or a compassionate universe. He only knew that for the first time in 20 years, his heart felt genuinely grateful. It was Teresa who rediscovered the forgotten garden behind the old machinery shed. Tucked away behind a half-collapsed wooden fence lay a quarter-acre plot, enclosed by a low stone wall, completely overgrown with wild weeds, tall thistles, and tangled briars. Yet, beneath the choking mass of weeds, a few stubborn rose bushes still survived, along with a thick patch of sweet jasmine that obstinately bloomed despite years of total neglect. Teresa stood at the edge of the forgotten plot, sensing immediately that this place held a deeply personal history. that love had been planted here long ago and was now suffocating under years of emotional abandonment. Without asking for permission, driven by a powerful internal urge, Teresa began pulling the weeds with her bare hands, moving slowly and deliberately so as to avoid straining her heavy body. She worked carefully, clearing away the dense overgrowth to reveal the neatly arranged stone borders that someone had laid down with great precision decades prior. The task took days of patient labor. Every afternoon, after finishing her household chores, Teresa would venture out to the hidden garden, working methodically until the afternoon sun began its descent behind the tree line. She cleared the thick briars, turned the rich soil with a small trowel, thoroughly watered the surviving rose bushes, and carefully transplanted wild saplings she discovered around the property. Her hands became rough and stained with dark earth, but a new, radiant joy took root in her spirit. The unique joy of breathing life back into something that the world had left for dead. She didn't fully analyze her motives, but deep down, she knew that by tending to this abandoned garden, she was simultaneously tending to her own wounded spirit and nurturing the fragile hope growing within her. Thomas remained entirely unaware of her project until a clear Tuesday morning, when he happened to push his wheelchair along the dirt path behind the shed, a route he almost never took. As he rounded the corner, he was brought to a sudden, complete halt by an extraordinary sight that made his heart leap into his throat. Color, vibrant, brilliant color, flooded a space that had been an ugly, overgrown eyesore for 2 decades. There were deep crimson roses blooming proudly against the stone wall, white daisies swaying gently in the breeze, and the unmistakable, intoxicating scent of jasmine filling the morning air. And sitting right in the center of it all, kneeling on a wooden pad with a trowel in hand, her face lightly dusted with soil and glowing with a peaceful smile, was Teresa. Thomas sat paralyzed in his chair. That was his mother's garden, the sanctuary she had planted with her own hands, where she used to sing softly while tending her flowers, and which he had deliberately allowed the weeds to reclaim after her death, because he simply could not bear the excruciating pain of looking at it without her. "What on earth are you doing out here?" Thomas asked, his voice coming out much sharper and harsher than he intended, hardened by the sudden rush of raw, unedited emotion. Teresa gasped, dropping her trowel as she scrambled to her feet, instinctively placing a hand over her heart as her face flushed with anxiety. "I am so terribly sorry, Mr. Thomas," she stammered out, quickly wiping her dirt-stained hands on her apron. "I didn't ask for your permission. I know I shouldn't have invaded your space. I just saw how beautiful the roses were underneath all those heavy weeds, and I couldn't bear to leave them suffocating. I thought no one cared about this spot anymore. I'll stop immediately if it bothers you, I promise." "No," the word tore from Thomas's throat with a sudden, desperate intensity that surprised even himself. He took a deep breath, attempting to regain his composure as he cleared his throat. "No, don't stop." He looked across the vibrant bed of crimson roses, his gray eyes shining with an emotion Teresa had never seen in him before. "This was my mother's garden. She planted every single one of these original rose bushes herself. After she passed away, I couldn't bring myself to come out here. I lacked the courage to care for it or even look at it, so I let the wild weeds take over. I convinced myself it hurt less to see it dead than to see it alive without her." Teresa remained silent, stepping forward with quiet grace and sitting on the edge of a low stone wall nearby, giving him the respectful space he needed. And there, in the quiet warmth of the morning sun, Thomas did something he had not done in 20 years. He began to talk about his past. He spoke at length about his mother, a remarkably resilient woman who had raised him alone on this farm after his father passed away in an accident. A woman who played the piano on peaceful Sunday afternoons and tended her garden as if every blossom were a beloved child. He spoke of losing her far too soon, and how he had thrown himself entirely into his military career afterward, traveling to distant posts and commanding troops, constantly running away from the hollow ache of his empty home. She called this specific corner her quiet sanctuary, Thomas said softly, gesturing with his chin toward a particularly robust rosebush, heavy with dark red blooms. She planted that exact bush on the day I was born. She used to tell me that as long as that rose bush produced flowers, it was a sign that I was safe and doing well, no matter how many thousands of miles away I might be. He paused, his voice growing thick with emotion. You know, even when I was deployed overseas in harsh, dangerous places, I would close my eyes at night and picture that red rose bush. It was my way of reminding myself that once upon a time, someone in this world loved me with her whole heart. Teresa looked at the tedious red rose bush that had stubbornly survived 2 decades of total neglect, feeling a tight knot form in her own throat. She gently shared her own story then, speaking softly of her mother, who had also raised her without a father, working long hours washing clothes and catering events just to keep a modest roof over their heads. She talked about how her mother had passed down her deep love for cooking and her unwavering faith in human kindness before being taken by illness when Teresa was just 19 years old, leaving her entirely alone in a vast, intimidating world. I think that's why I couldn't walk past this garden and leave it to die, Teresa confessed softly, running her fingers through the rich, dark soil. When I saw these flowers fighting so hard to survive beneath all those heavy weeds, it felt like I was looking at my own life. It felt as though someone needed to come along and care for them, the way I wished someone had cared for me when I was completely abandoned. She let out a soft, self-conscious laugh, brushing a stray tear from her cheek with the back of her dirty hand. I'm sorry. I'm rambling on like a fool. You're not rambling at all, Teresa, Thomas said softly, the harshness completely melted from his voice. Not at all. The two of them sat in quiet harmony, 2 orphans who had lost the mothers who taught them how to love, sitting together in a garden that one mother had planted and the other young woman had resurrected from the dead. In that shared silence, there was more genuine companionship than Thomas had experienced in 20 years of living in a house full of framed memories and empty rooms. Why did you never marry, Mr. Thomas? Teresa asked gently after a long, comfortable pause. Thomas offered a faint, melancholy smile, the kind that conveys far more grief than tears ever could. Because I completely stopped believing in it, my dear, he answered honestly. During my years in the service and throughout my life, I saw far too much of the dark side of human nature. I saw people marry for convenience, for money, or simply out of a pathetic fear of being alone. I convinced myself that genuine, unconditional love, the kind of selfless devotion my mother showed me, the kind where you care for another person without expecting anything in return, simply didn't exist in the modern world. I decided it was far better to live in total solitude than to live a comfortable lie. He looked at her, his eyes drifting over the vibrant garden beds. I spent 20 years completely convinced of that, until recently. What he left unsaid, but what hung palpably in the sweet morning air between them, was the quiet question that was now shaking the foundations of his world. What if I was completely wrong? What if, after 20 years of absolute cynicism, a pregnant, desperate young woman had knocked on my gate purely to prove that selfless love was real all along? Thomas looked at Teresa, adjusting the soil around the base of the rosebush, feeling a sudden, terrifying wave of vulnerability. It wasn't the physical fear he had trained for in the military, but a far deeper, ancient terror, the terrifying prospect of opening his heart to hope once again. The severe storm struck on a late October evening, rolling over the Iowa plains with a sudden, violent intensity. The sky turned an ominous, dark, bruised purple, before unleashing a torrent of rain and howling winds that battered the old farmhouse. The wind whistled menacingly through the wooden eaves, rain slammed against the window panes like thrown gravel, and sharp flashes of lightning illuminated the garden outside in stark, terrifying bursts. Thomas was sitting in the living room, unable to sleep amidst the roaring storm, when he heard a sound that chilled him to the bone, a sharp, anguished cry of agony emanating from Teresa's bedroom at the back of the house. He pushed his wheelchair down the hallway as fast as his arms could manage, his heart hammering violently against his ribs. He burst into her room to find Teresa curled into a tight ball on her bed, clutching her abdomen tightly, her face pale and drenched in sweat, her body contorted in intense pain. "Mr. Thomas," she gasped out between ragged breaths, her voice tight with panic. "Something is terribly wrong. The pains are coming so fast. I think the baby is coming right now. It's too early. It's almost a month too early. It can't be happening now." She broke into terrified, helpless sobbing, the primal fear of a mother who realizes her child is in grave danger and she is utterly powerless to stop it. Thomas felt a spike of blind panic, but years of military leadership instantly kicked in beneath the fear. The trained commander inside him took over, overriding the panic with sharp, focused determination. "Listen to me, Teresa," he commanded firmly, rolling his chair right up to the edge of the bed and gripping her trembling hand with immense strength. "Look at me right now. You are not alone in this. Do you hear me? You are not alone anymore. We are going to get through this together." He immediately reached for the landline telephone on the nightstand, but the receiver produced only dead silence. The storm had brought down the main power and phone lines across the county. The truck was parked in the barn, but neither of them could drive it to town in this blinding downpour, and the nearest hospital was over 20 miles away along flooded dirt roads. Thomas realized with a sickening knot in his stomach that they were entirely isolated. Then, a crucial memory flashed through his mind. Mrs. Gable, an elderly retired midwife, lived on the neighboring farmstead just under a mile down the road. She had delivered dozens of children across the county decades ago, before modern hospitals took over. But how could he possibly reach her in the middle of a torrential tempest without a telephone? Thomas looked at the back door, then at the wall of blinding rain outside, and finally down at his own paralyzed legs. He made a decision that, 24 hours earlier, he would have considered utterly suicidal. "I am going to get Mrs. Gable," Thomas stated with absolute finality. Teresa looked at him through her tears, her eyes wide with shock and terror. "What? No, Mr. Thomas, you can't go out in that. You'll freeze or get hurt. You can't." "I am going," Thomas cut her off, his voice absolute steel. "Hang on, Teresa. Just hold on." He threw on a thick canvas oilskin coat, grabbed a flashlight, and pushed himself out into the roaring tempest. What occurred over the next hour was a grueling ordeal that local farmhands would discuss for years with deep reverence. The moment Thomas cleared the shelter of the back porch, the storm hit him like a physical blow. The driving rain stung his face like needles, blinding him instantly, while the wind howled around his ears, trying desperately to overturn his wheelchair. The gravel driveway had transformed into a thick, treacherous river of mud. The small front wheels of his chair sank deep into the mire, sticking and spinning helplessly. Thomas threw every ounce of his upper body strength into the rubber rims, gritting his teeth and straining his shoulders as he forced the chair forward inch by agonizing inch. He pushed with a fierce, primal rage against his physical limitations, fighting the mud, the wind, and his own aging body. Halfway down the long driveway, his wheel caught a deep rut hidden under the standing water, and the chair flipped violently onto its side, throwing Thomas face first into the cold, freezing mud. He lay there in the dark, gasping for air, the taste of metallic dirt and cold rain filling his mouth. A dark, insidious voice, the familiar voice of 20 years of bitter resignation, whispered in his mind, that he should just give up, that it was impossible for a paralyzed man to navigate a hurricane, that no one would blame him if he just crawled back to the porch. But then, above the roar of the thunder, he pictured Teresa doubled over in pain, terrified and alone, and he pictured the innocent, fragile life fighting to be born. He remembered his mother's voice, telling him that a man's true character is revealed not when life is smooth, but when everything is falling apart. With a guttural roar of absolute defiance, Thomas dug his elbows into the freezing mud. He dragged his heavy, uncooperative lower body across the ground, hauled himself up by the frame of the overturned wheelchair, and through sheer, impossible force of will, flipped the heavy chair upright and pulled himself back into the seat. His shoulders burned with agony, a sharp muscle tear screaming in his left arm, but he grabbed the wheels once more and pushed forward into the dark storm. He fell a second time when a large fallen tree branch blocked the lane, bruising his ribs severely, but he dragged himself over the obstacle, hauled his chair across, and kept going. A man who had spent 2 decades sitting passively on a porch waiting to die was now crawling through an inferno of mud and water, fueled by a ferocious, beautiful purpose, the desperate need to save another human being. When the pale yellow porch light of Mrs. Gable's farmhouse finally flickered through the curtain of torrential rain, Thomas was barely conscious. His hands were raw and bleeding, his face was covered in dark mud, and his body was shaking violently from hypothermia. But he rolled up to her front door and pounded on the heavy oak wood with his bloodied fist, screaming for help with the absolute last reserve of strength in his lungs. The door flew open, and the elderly woman gasped in absolute horror at the sight of the mud-drenched, battered man collapsing in his chair. "Thomas, good Lord Almighty, what happened to you?" "The girl, at my house," Thomas gasped out, his chest heaving painfully. "The baby is coming. It's early. She's all alone. Please, God, Mrs. Gable, please come now." The sheer desperation in the voice of a man who had never asked anyone for a favor in his entire life was all Mrs. Gable needed. Within minutes, she was wrapped in a heavy coat, holding her emergency medical kit, and riding in the passenger seat of her adult grandson's 4-wheel-drive pickup truck, with Thomas's wheelchair secured in the back bed. They reached the farmhouse just in time. Mrs. Gable took charge of the room with calm, experienced authority, while Thomas sat shivering in his wheelchair right outside the closed bedroom door, wrapped in a dry wool blanket, refusing to go clean himself up until he knew they were safe. He listened to the rain gradually subside outside, his hands trembling as he prayed silently, praying with a deep, desperate faith he didn't know he still possessed. And then, just as the first gray light of dawn began to break through the retreating storm clouds, a sharp, clear, indignant cry pierced the quiet room. Mrs. Gable opened the door a few minutes later, her tired face breaking into a wide, triumphant smile. She walked out holding a small, tightly wrapped pink bundle and placed the newborn gently into Thomas's trembling arms, as Teresa was completely exhausted from the prolonged labor. Thomas looked down at the tiny, red, wrinkled face resting against his chest. The baby girl was small, having arrived early, but her lungs were strong, and her little heart was beating with fierce determination. As he looked at that microscopic miracle, weighing less than 6 pounds, Thomas felt his entire soul shatter and rebuild itself in a single second. 50 years of cynicism, 20 years of bitter loneliness, and all the hardened walls he had meticulously constructed around his heart evaporated into nothingness. "Welcome to the world, little one," Thomas whispered, his voice cracking with uncontrollable emotion as heavy tears tracked clean lines through the dried mud on his cheeks. "Welcome home." News of the harrowing night spread through the rural county like wildfire, and over the following days, something truly miraculous began to happen. The isolated farm, which had seen no visitors for 2 decades, suddenly became the center of a warm, bustling community. Mrs. Gable returned daily to check on mother and child. The neighbor from the North Farm brought over a massive pot of hot chicken stew. The local grocer delivered a crate of fresh milk and baby supplies with a wide smile, insisting it was on the house for the new little lady. Farmers stopped by to fix the storm damage on Thomas's roof, and local women dropped off soft knitted blankets and hand-me-down baby clothes. Thomas watched it all in a state of quiet wonder. He had spent 20 years believing that the world was cold, self-centered, and indifferent, only to realize that the kindness of his community had been waiting right outside his gate all along. They had simply been waiting for him to open his heart and let them in. Teresa had not only saved his life, she had restored his connection to humanity. A week after the birth, as the autumn sun warmed the porch, Teresa called Thomas into her room. She was sitting up in bed, cradling her sleeping daughter, her face filled with a quiet, profound resolve. "Mr. Thomas," Teresa began, her voice soft and trembling with emotion, "I've chosen her name." Thomas leaned forward in his chair, smiling softly. "What is it, my dear?" "Her name is Sarah, Sarah Thomas," Teresa said, looking directly into his eyes as tears welled in her own. "Sarah, after my mother, and Thomas, after you, because you saved both of our lives on the night of the storm. Because you opened your home when the entire world turned its back on us. If it weren't for your courage, neither of us would be breathing today." Thomas opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He reached out a weathered, trembling hand and gently brushed his thumb against the newborn's soft head. 20 years of believing he would die alone, leaving no mark upon the earth, and now a precious child would carry his name into the future, a child who would grow up calling this farm her home. He wasn't her biological father, but he knew with absolute clarity that fatherhood was not defined by blood. It was defined by the choice to step up, protect, and love unconditionally. "Sarah Thomas," he repeated reverently, tasting the beauty of the words. "It is the most beautiful name I have ever heard." Years flowed past the Iowa farmhouse, like the gentle, unhurried waters of a quiet river, transforming everything in their path. The delicate baby girl who arrived on that terrifying night of the storm grew into a healthy, energetic toddler, taking her very first steps across the hardwood floors of the living room, uttering her first words, and celebrating her birthdays with cheerful outdoor parties in the garden. The grand white house, once a silent, gloomy tomb for a broken man, became the brightest, most joyous home on the county line, echoing daily with laughter, music, and vibrant life. The garden that Teresa had rescued bloomed continuously year after year, meticulously maintained by her loving hands, and later joined by the tiny, enthusiastic hands of a little girl who loved nothing more than picking wild daisies to present to her grandfather. For that was what Sarah learned to call Thomas from the moment she began to speak: Gramps. No one had forced the title upon her. It simply flowed naturally from her innocent lips, as indisputable truths always do with children. Inspired by the love that surrounded him, Thomas resumed intensive physical therapy. Though he never regained the ability to walk independently, he gained tremendous upper body strength, allowing him to easily lift Sarah onto his lap, build a sturdy wooden swing set under the giant oak tree in the yard, and actively participate in every single moment of her upbringing. On a peaceful Sunday afternoon when Sarah was 4 years old, a sound drifted through the open windows that caused Teresa to drop her dish towel in the kitchen and rush into the sitting room with her hand over her mouth. The old mahogany piano, silent for more than 2 decades, was playing music once again. Thomas was sitting on the bench in his wheelchair, his weathered fingers awkwardly navigating the ivory keys, playing a gentle, nostalgic lullaby his mother used to play for him. Sitting right beside him on the wooden bench was little Sarah, her wide eyes filled with pure magic as she clapped her tiny hands in delight at every chord. Teresa leaned against the doorframe, weeping quietly tears of pure, unadulterated happiness as she watched the man who had lost everything regain his soul through the love of a child. The deep bond between Teresa and Thomas matured into something extraordinarily rare and profound, a silent, unbreakable devotion, built not on passionate, fleeting romance, but on mutual respect, deep gratitude, and shared redemption. They were two wounded souls who had discovered that they belonged together in the grand fabric of life. On a quiet evening beneath the shade of the oak tree, Thomas held Teresa's hand and asked her to stay, not as an employee or a cook, but as his lawful wife and partner for the rest of his days. They were married in a simple, beautiful ceremony right in the middle of the blooming rose garden, surrounded by Mrs. Gable, local farmhands, and the entire community that had embraced them. Many years later, on a bright sunny morning, Thomas sat on the front porch, enjoying the gentle warmth of the sun, just as he had on the very first day of this story. But nothing about his life was the same. Beside him sat Teresa, quietly stitching a dress for their growing daughter, while out in the garden, Sarah was chasing butterflies through the tall grass, her bright laughter filling the morning air. The sweet aroma of freshly brewed coffee drifted out from the kitchen, brewed perfectly to the exact taste that had once brought a dying heart back to life. Thomas reached out and gently laid his hand over Teresa's. She looked up from her sewing, meeting his eyes with a warm, radiant smile that required no words to communicate its depth. Thomas looked down the long gravel driveway toward the open iron gate at the edge of the property. He had made a strict rule never to lock that gate again, because, as he often told his family with a warm smile, a person never knows when life might send a weary traveler down the road who needs a home just as desperately as a lonely heart needs a family. Life has a quiet, profound way of testing us, often bringing us to our absolute knees, stripping away our comfort, and leaving us in the dark to wonder if we will ever feel warm again. We live in a world that frequently encourages us to harden our hearts, to build impenetrable walls after being hurt, and to convince ourselves that solitude is safer than the risk of opening up to another human being. We tell ourselves that our best days are behind us, that broken things cannot be repaired, and that true, selfless love is merely a fairy tale reserved for the fortunate few. Yet, as the journey of Thomas and Teresa shows us, the most beautiful chapters of our lives often begin right at the edge of our deepest despair. Sometimes, grace does not arrive with loud fanfare or dramatic miracles. It arrives quietly, disguised as a difficult problem, an unexpected burden, or a stranger knocking on our door in the middle of a cold morning. Family is not merely a matter of shared bloodlines or genetic inheritance. It is a conscious, daily choice, a sacred commitment to stand by someone through the storms of life, to share their heavy burdens, and to choose love when it would be infinitely easier to walk away. It is never, ever too late for a closed heart to reopen, nor is it ever too late for a life to find its true purpose. No matter how many years you have spent living in the dark, no matter how heavy the weight of past disappointments may feel, the capacity for healing and joy remains alive inside you, waiting quietly for a single spark of courage to ignite it once again. Kindness is never wasted, and the love we give away freely into the world has an extraordinary way of finding its back to us when we least expect it. Keep your heart open, leave your gate unlocked, and remember that as long as you are breathing, your story is far from over.